Good evening. I'm Harold Pachios. We're on the air again with another edition of Pachios on the News. And we've got a good one tonight, and I think you'll enjoy it and you'll learn a lot. Our guest is David J. Kramer, and we're going to talk about Ukraine and Russia, and this fellow is an expert, and we're all going to learn a lot from him. David is currently the executive director of the George W. Bush Institute and vice president of the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas, Texas. I believe, David, on the campus of Southern Methodist University. Is that correct?
That is correct, Harold. Exactly right.
David, first of all, I want to welcome you, David, to our Portland, Maine show. We are connected, for the audience, we are connected via Zoom with David. He's in Dallas, and we're in Portland, Maine. And David, I assume your boss, President Bush, is at this moment a lot closer to us here in Portland, maybe 25 minutes away in Kennebunkport, than he is to you in Dallas. Is that true?
It is true. He has good judgment. He gets out of Dallas in the summertime, and New England, since I'm from Massachusetts originally, is always much nicer in the summer than down here.
True, true. So I want to tell the folks a little bit about you. Prior to joining the Bush Institute, David was Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy at the McCain Institute and worked closely with Senator John McCain. He was also president of Freedom House, which is a well-known and very important Washington, D.C. NGO. During the George W. Bush presidential administration, he was Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and previous to that, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasia, with responsibility for Russia and Ukraine. So he's been at this a long time. His first job, I might add, at the State Department was as executive director of the United States Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, where he had the pleasure of working with the chairman of that commission, one Harold C. Pachios. And that's where David...
And Harold, if I could survive that experience, I could survive anything.
So David and I are good friends, and we traveled around the world together and met a lot of diplomats together. So,
we did indeed. And you were, all joking aside, you were a wonderful chairman and became a very good friend and just a delight to work with. So thank you for that experience.
Oh boy, let's wrap this up right now.
Call it a show.
Call it a show.
We're going to go downhill from here.
Yeah. So David has a master's degree from Harvard in Soviet Studies, undergraduate degree from Tufts in Soviet Studies, and is the author of a book entitled Back to Containment, Dealing with the Putin Regime.
Yep.
So this guy is a scholar, and his studies have been focused on Russia and to some degree Ukraine, and to a great degree on Russian leadership, including Mr. Putin. So I have talked to David a lot. I know he knows a lot about Putin. Is it fair to say, David, that beginning in your college years, when you went to undergraduate school, your career has focused on understanding Russia and its predecessor government in the Soviet Union?
It is indeed, Harold. Yeah, I started focusing on this actually in high school. I went to a public high school in southeastern Massachusetts, where we had a choice of Russian or French. And so I went with the unconventional Russian. And family came from Latvia back in the early 1900s and had an interest from that as well. And then studied it in college, as you said, and continued it as in a master's degree at Harvard. And it was still the Soviet Union back then. That's how old I am. But yeah, I've been following it ever since. And as you indicated in my previous jobs, have focused in particular on U.S. policy toward the Russia, the successor to the Soviet Union, or at least one country that was a successor to the Soviet Union, as well as the rest of the region.
When you were Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia, your focus was both Ukraine and Russia?
And Belarus and Moldova, two other countries in that region. And so I traveled to the region extensively. I visited Russia on numerous times. I have not been in Russia since 2009. I went one time after I left my government service, and that was enough for me. And just a quick story, I was involved with Bill Browder, who had been a strong investor in Russia, but then had his visa yanked because he kept complaining about corruption problems and lack of good governance in Russia. Browder's attorney, Sergei Magnitsky, was arrested by Russian authorities and accused of a fraud of $230 million. And they arrested him. Magnitsky is the one who actually exposed the fraud, though he got accused of it by the same people who committed the fraud. Died in prison, and Browder then went on a campaign to seek justice in Magnitsky's memory. I helped him when I was at Freedom House in advocating for that legislation that passed the U.S. Senate by a vote of 92-4. There aren't many things that pass 92-4 these days. That was back in 2012. And I have since then been sanctioned by the Russian government, would be arrested if I showed up on Russian territory. And in 2018, when President Trump met with President Putin in Helsinki, Putin said he would be willing to allow Robert Mueller, who was investigating Russian interference in the election in 2016, to interrogate a bunch of Russians in exchange for President Trump allowing a bunch of Americans to be interrogated by Russian authorities. I was on that list. So you can see why I haven't been back to Moscow in many years.
I want to encourage our audience to get the book, Bill Browder's books, two books actually, that he's written. It's absolutely fascinating, exposing corruption in Russia, and then they come to kill you. They want to kill you.
Exactly, yes.
And,
yes.
And no doubt they want to kill you too. So, as you point out, yeah, that's quite a story, and I know you are involved in it. So Browder is a friend of yours?
He is, yeah. Yep, and deserves enormous credit for pressing for human rights accountability among an endless list of human rights abuses by Russian officials, starting with Putin himself and working the list on down.
So, again, before we go on, I want to urge our listeners and viewers to just go on the internet. If you want to get the book, go on the internet and put in William Browder's name. And
yeah, Red Notice was his first book, yeah.
Yeah, Red Notice was the first book. I read that book. I was absolutely captivated by it. Yep. Really extraordinary book. If you want to learn about how the Russians do business and how Putin does business, read this book, and then you will be confronted with reality. So while we're talking about reality, David, I read last week in the opinion page of the Times, Tom Friedman's column. Now, Friedman, many of us have been reading for decades. He's a knowledgeable guy. He spent a lot of time abroad all over the world. He's a very good writer. I know that many people, liberals, conservatives, and moderates read Friedman. I know a lot of conservatives that have read Friedman for years. Friedman is rough on Donald Trump and his Ukraine policy. And I'm not going to ask you to agree or disagree with him, but maybe we can talk about some of the issues he raises. Sure. I'll just provide a little bit of background by reading from the first paragraph of Friedman's column last week, when he says, "I am trying to balance President Trump's commendable desire to end the murderous war in Ukraine with the utterly personalized, seat-of-the-pants, open, often partial way he's going about it. including the energy that everyone involved has to expend feeding his ego and avoiding his wrath, before they even get to the hellish compromises required for peace. I have covered many diplomatic negotiations since becoming a journalist in 1978, but I have never seen one where one of the leaders, in this case Ukraine's President Zelensky, felt the need to thank our president about 15 times in the roughly 4.5 minutes he addressed him with the press in the room, not to mention the flattery that our other European allies felt they needed to heap on him as well. And then he says about Putin, when they have to constantly look over their shoulder, we're talking about the participants in the peace process, have to constantly look over their shoulder to make sure Trump is not shooting them in the back with social media posts before Putin shoots them in the front with a missile. Our president doesn't understand that when Putin says to the Ukraine, in effect, marry me or I'll kill you, Zelensky needs more than an American marriage counselor. So he's saying, how is this going to work? This approach doesn't work. So he says Trump does not get this. Unlike any American president in the last 80 years, how important, he says, is the transatlantic alliance and a shared commitment to democracy, free markets, human rights, and rule of law. Is that those four things, rule of law, human rights, commitment to democracy, and free markets, is that the core of what we're talking about here, of what's at stake in this war with Ukraine, other than the freedom of the Ukrainian people, which is threatened?
It is, I think, Harold. It is also about Putin's interest in essentially destroying and taking over Ukraine. Putin does not want Ukraine to become a successful, thriving democracy that is more integrated with the Euro-Atlantic community, because Ukraine is a fellow Slavic state. It would then become a potential competitor and challenger to the kind of corrupt authoritarian system that Putin oversees in Russia. And Putin is also interested in reconstituting Russia as a great power, restoring Russian control over its neighbors. Remember, he described the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, overlooking World War II, overlooking World War I, overlooking the Holocaust, all of these things. For many people who live outside of Russia, Ukrainians as well as others, the breakup of the Soviet Union was the best thing because it gave them their freedom that had been suppressed by the Soviet Union when they were forcibly incorporated into that country. And so I think democracy and human rights, rule of law, free markets are all part of this. But this is also, we have to remember, the worst security crisis on the European continent since World War II that includes the forcible takeover of territory that is not part of Russia. It started in 2014. It didn't start just in 2022. It started in 2014 when Putin seized and illegally annexed Crimea, the peninsula part of Ukraine. Putin then, with dizzy with success, to borrow an old Stalinist phrase, moved into the eastern part of Ukraine in 2014. And it's important to recall that from 2014 until February 24th of 2022, when Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, more than 14,000 Ukrainians lost their lives in that 8-year period. So from 2014 until 2022, it was a violent situation caused by Putin, caused by Russia. And then, of course, you fast forward to February 24th, 2022, with the full-scale invasion. Putin grossly underestimated Ukrainians. He thought Russian forces would be greeted as liberators. He expected the Ukrainian government to fall, or that Zelensky would flee, or that the people would kill him. He expected the war to be over in a matter of days and weeks. And here we are now in September, of 2025, and the war is still raging. And just in the past 2 weeks since President Trump met with Putin in Alaska, Russian bombing has actually picked up. It has not let up. So this remains a very hot war, and it is driven by Putin. And so you may hear people conflate responsibility for this war. We've heard even the president talk about how Ukraine shouldn't have taken on a country 15 times its size. Ukraine didn't take on Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. What Ukraine has been trying to do ever since is to defend itself, to try to regain control over its land, to ensure its freedom, and to protect lives. And I think that's at the root cause of this, which is Putin's responsibility for this war. This is not a situation where both sides deserve blame. This is about as clear and black and white as they come. Ukraine being the target and victim of Russian aggression, and Russia being the guilty party for launching, first in 2014, and then on a larger scale in 2022, the invasion of Ukraine.
That's pretty simply it. We get a lot from the administration about, well, it's complicated and both sides are at fault, and I can never find why Ukraine is at fault. People said to me, well, one friend said to me, well, they were talking about Ukraine going into NATO, and that was a provocation. And I said, well, if that's a provocation, maybe Poland's next, because they're in NATO too.
Yeah. So, and the other part of that, Harold, is you got to remember, and the reason it is important to keep in mind the 2014 invasion. In 2013, when protests started in Ukraine because then pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, decided not to sign agreements. They weren't with NATO, they were with the European Union. In 2010, during Yanukovych's first year as president, Ukrainian parliament passed legislation saying Ukraine would no longer pursue NATO membership. So in 2013, 2014, during the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine, NATO was not the issue. Nobody was talking about Ukraine joining NATO. The issue then that Putin didn't like was Yanukovych was about to sign some agreements with the European Union. It wasn't even membership in the European Union. Putin pressured Yanukovych not to sign those agreements. That sparked the Euromaidan revolution, and then Putin launched his initial invasion of Ukraine starting in late February of 2014. Nobody was talking about NATO and Ukraine in the same sentence in 2014. Now, after Zelensky won the presidency in Ukraine in a free and fair election, I observed both rounds of that election.
Were you there? Were you in the Ukraine then? Yeah.
I was in Ukraine for both rounds in January 2019 and February 2019. Yeah. And then he won in the second round because to win a presidential election in Ukraine, it's a direct election. It's not through anything like our electoral college. And he didn't secure 50% in the first round. He then got Zelensky got 73% of the vote in the second round. And so he came in with a strong mandate. One of his goals was to seek deeper ties with NATO and eventual NATO membership. The problem there with people you mentioned, Harold, who blame NATO enlargement, NATO wasn't responding in a positive way to Zelensky's pleas. Zelensky would knock on the door. President Biden basically said no. You had Chancellor Scholz in Germany saying no. And so while Zelensky sought deeper ties with NATO, NATO was not reciprocating. And so even come late 21 into early February 22, the Zelensky wasn't getting anywhere with his pursuit of NATO. It is, I would respectfully argue, a way for people who don't want to assign blame to Putin and Russia to blame NATO and the United States. And to me, it is just fundamentally wrong and misguided.
So the president has said, well, there's got to be some people got to give up some land, meaning the Ukrainians have to give up land, and which is somewhat of a victory for and justification for the invasion by Putin. How can it end without giving up some land? I mean, the Russians occupy much of the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. Putin is in this. He's in to win, not to make friends. He's not leaving. The war will go. Won't the war go on? Won't the war go on for years, as long as he doesn't get land?
Well, there are a couple of elements to this, Harold. One is, I think you're absolutely right. Putin has shown zero interest in ending the war. He thinks he is winning. He thinks he can outlast Western support for Ukraine, and he thinks Ukraine will collapse because, after all, in Putin's ridiculous mind, he thinks Ukraine is run by a bunch of Nazis, even though President Zelensky is Jewish. So Putin has shown zero interest in ending the war. He also has shown no interest in meeting with Zelensky, even though President Trump has been pushing this bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky, then potentially a trilateral meeting. Putin doesn't view Zelensky as a legitimate president. Zelensky, to be clear, was elected by 73% of the vote in 2019. His term ordinarily would have ended in 24 and he would have been up for re-election. But because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine declared martial law. And under Ukrainian law, you cannot conduct elections during martial law. And so Zelensky has had his term extended because of the Russian invasion. But Putin likes to say, well, Zelensky's not legitimate. He has overstayed his term. And Putin, I mean, it's ironic that Putin, who has rigged elections repeatedly during his time, is accusing Zelensky, who won in a free and fair election that I observed, of being illegitimate. The Russians currently control about 18 to 19% of Ukrainian territory. That includes the Crimean Peninsula. And you rightly pointed out, Harold, that they do not control all of the Donbas region. They control almost all of the Luhansk region. They only control about 70 to 72% of the Donetsk region. What Putin has insisted on is that Ukraine both recognize Russian control over the areas that Russia occupies, but the Ukraine then abandon the almost 30% of the Donetsk region that Ukraine currently occupies. What Putin wants in these negotiations is what he is incapable of achieving through military means. He wants Russian control over all of the Donbass, even though militarily he has been unable to secure control over that region. To me, it should not be the business of the President of the United States or any other leader to be negotiating Ukrainian territory. It should be up to President Zelensky and his leadership to determine Ukraine's position in this. It is against the Ukrainian constitution to recognize Russian control over Ukrainian territory. But one final point on this, Harold, that I think is very important for your viewers and listeners. When there's talk about Ukrainian territory, let's remember there are people living on this territory. So you're not just talking about ceding some land. You're talking about consigning hundreds of thousands, millions of Ukrainians to live under Russian control, and living under Russian control for those who have had to endure it over the past now 11 years, when it goes back to 2014, has been absolute misery. It's horrible to live under Russian control for Ukrainians. They don't support it. The polls show that a majority of Ukrainians are opposed to territorial concessions. And so it should be left for a negotiation between Zelensky and Putin on these issues. And it should also be something that the Ukrainians decide, not us.
So I mean, if the Ukrainians don't want to give up just even the land that the Russians now occupy militarily, what can put an end to this? What can bring Putin to the table and say, okay, let's resolve this. Let's stop fighting. We'll stop, sending drones and airplanes over to kill women and children.
I think what the United States, together with our European allies, needs to do is to apply much greater pressure on Putin. And it starts with by making it clear we are on Ukraine's side. We should not adopt a posture of being a neutral mediator. It is clear who the victim is here. It is clear who the guilty party is. And the United States should be unambiguously on the side of Ukraine. That alone would send a signal to Putin that we are not backing down. But then there are other steps.
But before we leave that, do you think that there's reason for Putin to believe that we are not unequivocally on the side of Ukraine, that we're somewhat neutral?
I think there have been comments made by the president and others in his meetings with Steve Witkoff that give Putin reason to think that the United States is not as strongly on Ukraine's side as we should be.
And does that make a difference? And does that make a difference to Putin?
Absolutely. Yeah. He thinks that there is an opening here that he can exploit. And I think Witkoff's various meetings with Putin have not been terribly helpful because he doesn't seem to come away with a clear understanding of what it is Putin is offering. Witkoff seems to come back with a Pollyanna view of Putin's position when Putin, frankly, hasn't budged, hasn't made any compromise.
Witkoff is his emissary. Is he a real estate developer? What is his?
Yeah, his background. That's how he and Trump have known each other.
Okay, so he
has no experience in foreign policy. He has no background on Russia, Ukraine. And yet he is playing an instrumental role. Keith Kellogg is also an important player. He is a retired military general, very well respected, a lot of experience on foreign and national security issues. Kellogg seems to be the point person for Ukraine, but not for Russia. And yet, if you saw the pictures of the last meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky, sitting on the couch were the Vice President, Secretary of State Rubio, and Steve Witkoff, not Keith Kellogg. He was standing behind the couch. So I wish Kellogg would take a more prominent role in all of this over Witkoff. I think we'd be better off. But just coming back to your earlier question, Harold, so making it clear we stand unambiguously with Ukraine, making it clear through the Europeans in light of the new arrangement President Trump has worked out with NATO and our European allies, that military assistance will not just continue, but be increased. And ramping up sanctions on Russia. The president has been talking about this now for months and has not yet pulled the trigger on additional sanctions, including going after the shadow fleet that enables Russia to export its gas and oil. Moving from, and this was a failure of the Biden administration, moving from not just freezing the $300 billion that Russia stupidly left in Western financial institutions in 2022, but seizing that money and making it available to Ukraine so Ukraine can use it to purchase weapons or any other needs that it may have. And then imposing these tariffs. Now, the Trump administration has done this on India, but China, in fact, imports more Russian energy than India does. And yet the administration has not yet pulled the trigger on raising tariffs on China because of its import of Russian energy.
And is that the money they're using to finance the war?
Absolutely. Yeah. China is helping Russia through importing lots of Russian energy and also providing dual-use technology and supporting Russia in other ways. Less so overt military assistance coming from China, but China plays a key role in supporting Putin's campaign, no question.
And the North Koreans have a formal alliance with Russia, and they are actually fighting for Russia. They're participants in the war, right?
They have, the dictator there, Kim Jong-un, has sent somewhere on the order of 20,000 troops. This is something where Kim and Putin have something in common. They view their troops as cannon fodder. They don't care what happens to them. In fact, they send troops to the front to absorb the bullets and missiles and other weapons that the Ukrainians use in the hope that they will use up Ukraine's supply, and then they can send another division to perform the
bodies will absorb all the bullets, and then we'll run out of bullets.
This is the kind of thinking that Putin and Kim have in common. So North Korea's also provided some missiles to Russia for its campaign. One other player, of course, is Iran. Iran was providing Shahed drones in the early phases of this war, and has shared the technology for those drones. And that has enabled Russia to produce and use a lot more drones than they did in the early stages of this war. And so you have this, we call it here, the Bush Institute, CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And this axis is working together. There are a lot of things that keep them apart. They're not exactly best buddies, but they have some things in common. One is to make sure none of them loses. And second, to do damage and harm to us. And so if Russia, or us meaning not just the United States, but the West in general, and that's what Iran, North Korea, and China have in common with Russia.
So what do you think that the pressure that you just described, increasing or is at least maintaining a high level of military support by sending them supplies, sanctions, tariffs on the oil, etc. Do you think that, why would Putin respond to that? I mean, he'd just ignore that, wouldn't he?
Pressure. It's pressure and strength. Putin responds to strength. He responds to pressure. The Russian economy is not doing well. They're really burning through their reserves. And if income from exports of energy were to decline, they'd be even in worse shape. The ability to cut down on their exports of energy through the shadow fleet would inflict some real financial harm on Russia. If we raise the tariffs on China, I think would prefer to do business with us than with Russia at the end of the day if forced to make a choice. And so Putin, I think it's a mistake to overestimate the Russians. I made the point earlier, Putin made an enormous mistake of underestimating the Ukrainians. We need to be careful of not overestimating the Russians. Russia has had difficulty in staffing up the people to send to the front lines. Remember that Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was the leader of the Wagner mercenary group, was going into Russian prisons and recruiting people there. They have hoodwinked migrants, particularly from Central Asia, even from some African countries who have been in Russia, forcing them to the front lines. Putin does not have an endless supply. Russia is bigger than Ukraine. Russia has more people than Ukraine, but Russia is also struggling to maintain its forces. There is also one other point here, which is the Russian military has been riddled with corruption, and this has been to Ukraine's favor and advantage. Had Russia's military been more competent, less corrupt, we likely would have seen further Russian advances in the early phases of this war and a better performance by Russia. Now, again, don't overestimate the Russians, both in terms of their military capabilities and in terms of their ability to sustain this conflict.
But right now, aren't they kind of winning? Aren't they taking more territory? No.
A little bit, but at enormous cost, Harold. Keep in mind, Ukraine has now inflicted over 1 million casualties on the Russian side. Of that, roughly maybe 300,000 or so are killed in action. The rest are injured.
But Putin's
enormous cost.
Putin's the decision maker, and he doesn't care, you say.
He agreed, but he will care if the guys on the front line say, we have had enough. And there have been instances of Russian forces on the front lines who have just said, our commanders are corrupt, they're idiots, they're treating us like cannon fodder, as we already talked about. Now, there are also Russian forces further back on the front lines who are there to shoot and kill any Russians who try to flee the front lines. That's very Stalinist. And so there is, Putin thinks he's winning. Putin thinks he can outlast us. We need to make it clear to him that both of those things are wrong.
That's not clear now, is it?
It isn't clear. Putin has essentially, I think, dissed President Trump after their meeting in Alaska by refusing to meet with Zelensky. Zelensky has indicated a readiness to meet with Putin. Putin also got President Trump to drop the push for a ceasefire. And so I think that was a mistake as well.
So this is the art of the deal in a real estate transaction is a lot different than this. And I think that's that may be part of the problem, how the president sees the world. Oh, this one will do it because he loves me. In fact, he's said that in the last week or so. Putin really likes me, and so he'll do what I want. And of course, it's not happening, and it's a bad reading of Putin. You mentioned Witkoff, the real estate developer, who's our point man in this whole thing. He was on Tucker Carlson not long ago. Did you read about that? He was on Tucker Carlson, and he said he was meeting with Putin, and he said he's a very nice man, and he's a straight shooter. Based on what you've been studying over the decades, you wouldn't agree that he's a very nice man and a straight shooter, right?
I would not. Yeah, those are phrases, words that I would not use to describe Putin. I mean, Putin, remember, it came up, not the highest ranks, but came up through the ranks of the KGB during the Soviet period. He is a master at studying the people that he's sitting at the table with. And I think he has found a person in Witkoff that he can say the right things to, or Witkoff doesn't interpret them correctly, because Witkoff, at least earlier on, I think the last meeting was different, has relied on a Kremlin interpreter, not on a State Department or embassy interpreter. And Witkoff also can't quite seem to understand what Putin is offering. When, after his latest visit to Moscow, Witkoff then gave a readout to European allies, and from public reports, the indications were it was a very confusing readout. And so, on the one hand, this is a complicated war. On the other hand, it isn't. And the reason it isn't is Russia needs to get out of Ukraine. The president, I think, admirably wants to end the fighting. I think he is truly bothered by the senseless killing and slaughter that is taking place there. But the responsibility for it lies with Putin, and the way to end this is to pressure Putin into leaving Ukraine. That's the way to get this resolved. But unless and until we, together with our European allies, make that crystal clear, I'm afraid to say the fighting will continue. And pushing for a ceasefire is a good test. Putin's not interested in a ceasefire. He wants to keep killing Ukrainians. And so I think the president should return to a position he held before Alaska, which was President Trump, wanted a ceasefire, and he should stick to that position.
Back for a moment to Tucker Carlson and Witkoff, the real estate developer. He returned from Moscow, and he told Tucker Carlson that he was told that Putin told him that when Trump was shot at the rally in Pennsylvania, that Putin went to his priest and prayed together with the priest for the president, not because he was the leader of the United States, or the potential leader, might be elected president, but because he was a dear friend of Putin's, and he was praying for his friend. And he then gave Witkoff a painting to bring back to the president, I think a painting of Trump's favorite subject, which is Trump, and gave it to the president and told him about how Putin prayed for him. And the president was deeply touched by that nice gesture from the nice man.
According to Witkoff, But actually, just on that point, Harold, very quickly, during Witkoff's last visit, Putin gave Witkoff a medal to give to the parents of an American who fought on the side of the Russians. This was, he was killed while fighting on the side of the Russians. He clearly had some mental health challenges. One of the parents of this American who was killed is a senior official of the CIA. This is about as cynical a ploy that Putin could use, and he wanted to just sort of dig it in a little more. Unfortunately, at least according to media reports, Witkoff thought this was a nice gesture, and he passed along this medal. I would have told Putin what he could have done with the medal rather than to accept it on behalf of those parents.
Yeah, well, we won't get into details on what you would have told me.
We'll leave it there, yes.
We'll leave it there. But, all right, so strength. You think that we got to show strength not
Absolutely.
weakness.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And of course, that's what Tom Friedman said. He says Putin wants not peace, but victory.
Yeah.
And he quotes Leon Aaron, who you probably know, the author of Riding the Tiger. So he quotes him and he says, Leon Aaron told Tom Friedman that Putin must have Ukraine for all sorts of ideological and domestic political reasons, which you covered at the beginning of this interview, and he will not stop seeking it and sacrificing for it unless the West makes the cost of war prohibitive, militarily and economically.
Yeah.
And that's what you're telling us.
Yeah, look, Putin does not want peace, P-E-A-C-E. He wants a peace, P-I-E-C-E, of Ukraine.
Right.
And he's shown that repeatedly.
So we're back to the point that without this, if we're not going to show strength and force and put pressure on, this war is just going to go on and on and on.
Sadly, tragically for Ukraine. Look, the Ukrainians more than anyone want this war to end. They're the ones who are suffering and dying every single day. Just in the past week, there have been massive Russian bombing campaigns of missiles and drones and others. Ukrainians need more help when it comes to self-defense, but massive bombing campaigns, so they're killing Ukrainians. And the president, I think, is moved by this. Apparently so is the First Lady, because remember, the president has said now several times, I've had a great conversation with Putin, and then he goes and sees the First Lady, and she reminds him, well, that's nice because he just bombed another apartment building or kindergarten. And so Putin just thinks that he can get his way. He's gotten the president to move off of a ceasefire. And the way to deal with this is to demand a ceasefire, no more meetings with Putin, no talking about U.S.-Russian trade and commerce and investment. That we shouldn't be talking about those issues while Putin is slaughtering Ukrainians. It's unseemly, it's inappropriate, and it sends the wrong signals because Putin is interested in moving past the Ukraine issue, views it as an obstacle to better bilateral ties. And we want to make sure that the president, our president, is not inadvertently sending those kinds of signals as well.
So force, strength, standing our ground, all of that you think is the critical ingredient for resolving this. And I want to go back to what you talked about earlier. You're dealing with a guy who you say, and many others say, is basically a thug.
Yeah.
He's a thug. He's like a thug who on one of these streets of a big city in America where Trump wants to send the National Guard to arrest the thug.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying he needs to be treated like he's a thug on the streets of America. Strength. Go after him. That's what you're saying?
Absolutely. To boil it down to back in the schoolyard days when we were kids, there was a bully. The best way to deal with a bully is to punch him in the nose. Now, this bully has nuclear weapons, and I don't mean to be frivolous and advocating for a position of strength with this. But Putin and others in the Kremlin like to talk about their nuclear weapons. The whole point there is I don't think they're serious about using them, but it gets us to back down. It happened with the Biden administration, which I think tied Ukraine's hands behind its backs. With restrictions imposed on weapons transfers. I think it has continued with the current administration. I don't take the threats of use of nuclear weapons by Russia seriously. I think it is designed to get us to back off. And so we have to remind them, we have nuclear weapons too. And the previous administration made it clear to the Russians that if they were to use a tactical nuclear weapon to try to affect the outcome of the war inside Ukraine, we would respond militarily, not necessarily with a nuclear weapon. That's a dangerous path to go down. However, those warnings, I think, were taken seriously by the Kremlin. It was a sign of strength, and Putin hasn't done it. But the other point, Harold, is how this is important not just for Ukraine. It's not just about Europe. This has global repercussions and implications. Among Ukraine's strongest supporters are Taiwanese. They recognize how the United States and the West respond to Russia's invasion will have an impact on the thinking in Beijing as it looks toward Taipei and the island of Taiwan. How we respond will have huge implications for how other authoritarian leaders view the possibility of forcibly seizing territory of a neighbor and getting away with it. And we should make sure that Putin does not get away with this.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking about what can pressure Donald Trump into taking these strong positions, which he seems unwilling to take vis-a-vis Putin, strong against Putin, who he thinks is his friend. So what can pressure him? Well, Congress. I'm thinking about Lyndon Johnson and the war in Vietnam. And as you know, I worked for LBJ. And the thing that brought him down politically and weakened him politically were Democratic senators, Frank Church and Fulbright, holding hearings on the war in Vietnam and exposing the weakness in the war and why we were going to lose. And it was the end of Lyndon Johnson. And there were Democrats who brought him down. Now, I think that if Republican senators were to begin to push back against Trump and say what you've been saying, we need strength, that would be very helpful. There's a problem, however, and I know you've been involved in Republican administrations. When I knew you, you were involved in the Republican administration. The Republicans seem to be going back to isolationism, some of them, and saying this is not our war, and there's a lot of pushback against giving any aid to Ukraine. Let it go. Let the Russians take over the whole country. Some of them say that. So is there any way that there can be pressure, domestic political pressure on Trump to bring about a change in his approach to Putin?
I honestly don't see it right now, Harold, although in fairness, Senator Graham and Senator Blumenthal put forward legislation that would call for significant tariffs on China and India and any other country, for that matter, that imports Russian energy, calls for additional sanctions. And they had 85 senators co-sponsoring this piece of legislation. So it was bipartisan.
Yeah.
But then they backed down because the president didn't want them to move it forward. It is hard for me to see pressure coming from the Congress these days, given the control in the House and the Senate. There may be a different approach that would work with this president as opposed to President Johnson. And President Trump has talked openly about this. He would love to be the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. Mm-hmm. And I think if people said the way to do that is to end this war in Ukraine, and the way to end the war in Ukraine is by imposing more pressure on Putin, maybe that would work. And so, look, if President Trump can bring this war to an end in a way that does not compromise Ukraine's territory and sovereignty, and does it in a sustainable and just manner, I'd support giving him the Nobel Peace Prize. And so I think appealing to him that way may have a better luck than trying to pressure him.
Yeah, good point. I agree with you. And what you're saying is he's not going to get the Nobel Peace Prize unless this war gets resolved, and he's dealing with the thug, and the only way that thug is going to cooperate with him and end this war is to punch. It's to punch him. Okay.
Exactly.
Well, that's pretty. That leaves me with a nice, simple understanding, and I think there is something to that. David, before we end this, which will be in about less than 10 minutes, I want to ask you about a couple of other things that you've done there at the Bush Presidential Center. And two of the initiatives interest me. One is human rights. At the Bush Center, you you do a lot of work in the field of human rights. And it's something that you know a lot about. You were the Assistant Secretary of State responsible for our human rights outreaches around the country, around the world. So you wrote something that I thought was interesting. You talked about the human rights reports. Would you tell us a little bit about these human rights annual reports and the reason they're so important and what's happening now?
So the State Department has been issuing these reports for decades, and they come out usually around February or March of every year. They provide important milestones for how countries are doing when it comes to respect for human rights. And they are produced by every administration. Some administrations make adjustments to them based on where they want to place emphasis in certain areas of human rights. The current administration, this has been publicly reported, downplayed issues that involve LGBTQ rights, women's empowerment, and those kinds of things. And the reports that came out just a couple weeks ago have been controversial, source of controversy. There have been accusations that some of the reports tamp down criticism of countries that are in favor with the current administration. El Salvador, for example, Israel, and a couple of others, and then some other countries that received unusual criticism. Brazil, for example, where the current administration has been very critical of the trial of former Brazilian President Bolsonaro, or South Africa, where the administration has argued that white Afrikaners have been targets of a genocide campaign. And so there is a fair bit of controversy with the latest issuance of the human rights reports, both in terms of how they are shorter than they used to be. And to be honest with you, Harold, they did need some condensing. The delay in the issuance of them, and then the actual substance. That said, let me make one other point on these. Some of the reports are pretty damning, and rightly so, about the situations in certain countries. And yet the Department of Homeland Security wants to deport undocumented people to some of these countries and has ended what is called temporary protective status for Haitians and Venezuelans and Ukrainians and others. I think the Department of Homeland Security needs to read the human rights reports that the State Department has issued and hopefully reconsider the ending of this temporary protective status, TPS as it's called, for people before they send them back to these very challenging environments that could put their lives in danger.
And what you're saying is they're deporting them to areas where they know human rights are not respected. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Therefore, they can't be critical of these countries that repress human beings because they need them to send people to them.
You got it. Exactly right.
Okay. The other thing is, related matter, that the George W. Bush Presidential Center talks a lot about is immigration. And I have printed out something what President George Bush said: at its core, immigration is a sign of a confident and successful nation. Immigrants' talent and hard work and love of freedom have helped us become the leader of the world. And so you folks have put out a lot of statements and so forth urging reformation of the immigration system to, as you say, in order to take advantage of the opportunity to ensure future prosperity, vitality, and security of our nation, which would require legislation. Is that right? To reform the system.
Yes.
Okay. And
yes.
You go on and you say, we need top to bottom reform that meets the needs of our economy, addresses current migration patterns, welcomes refugees and asylum seekers, and provides reasonable legislative solutions for the undocumented, including dreamers. That's not going to happen either, because they're opposed to it in the Congress.
Yeah, right now at least. But, you know, at the Bush Institute here in Dallas, we take a very solutions-based approach. It's easy to criticize. I've made a living out of doing it in the think tank world. But we try to offer solutions. And even though things may seem a ways off, we think it's still important to lay out what we should be doing. We believe in legal immigration, strong supporters of welcoming people, asylum, people who are seeking refuge in the United States. Sorry. And but we also recognize the importance of a secure border. That needs to be done as well. There also, I think, needs to be a stronger dose of humanity in terms of how we treat people here. These are our fellow human beings. And so we do support legal immigration here. We think our country needs immigrants to come in. People who do things from setting up new exciting tech companies to tilling our farms. It covers the whole gamut of what immigrants contribute to this country. And it's a cliche, but it's true, obviously. We're in a land of immigrants, and we believe in an ideal, not so much in an identity. And that's why we think that there should be a pathway forward for legal immigration.
And so you'll continue that work at the Bush Center? And
we will. That work, we work on education issues, immigration, free markets and economic growth. Veterans and military families work on the domestic side. We have 2 leadership programs. We work in the global arena as well on democracy and freedom and human rights, on global health. PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, that was launched during President Bush's first term, that has saved over 26 million lives. And we have a museum here as part of our campus as well. So any folks in Maine that want to come visit us, particularly in the winter maybe, more than welcome. bushcenter.org. Would love to welcome you here.
I'm looking at you over the screen. Your office obviously overlooks part of Dallas. Is it hot in Dallas today?
Today is in the 90s, which is not bad for August in Dallas. It's supposed to be in the 80s over the next couple of days. So, well, David, we have not had a bad summer by Dallas standards. By Maine standards, forget about it.
We got to wrap it up. I want to thank you very much for coming on the show. That was very interesting, and I think our audience will learn a lot from it. Thanks very much, David, and I look forward off screen to seeing you soon and getting together with you.
Likewise, Harold. It's been a pleasure. Always great to chat with you. Thanks so much for having me.